said, my name's Bethany Pratt. I'm the horticulture agent in Jefferson County, more commonly known as Louisville. And the majority of my work with cooperative extension revolves around managing 10 community gardens in the city of Louisville as a part of our partnership with Louisville Metro government. So this is what we are going to talk about, and I'm gonna, there we go. So let's see. So community garden, there are, whoop, hold on. That's speedy there. That's not what we want. All right, so community garden, 2 parts of, right, kind of the same thing, but 2 really important parts of making a successful community garden as a whole. So I want to start by thinking about those 2 words individually, and then we'll go into talking about how we put them together in different contexts. So first, we want to define community, and how I think about community in this context is the people who will be involved in any aspect of the garden or green space for any length of time. So that, right, expands out your definition of community right off the bat. So that's just not the people who are actively participating in the garden as gardeners. That includes neighbors, councilmen, business owners, people who walk by either because they live around the corner or because they are visiting. Community is a lot of different people. And we like to think about community, the specific community for a garden or green space as any resident within a 3-block radius of that particular garden or green space. If you're not in a block radius, you want to say about a half a mile from that garden or green space, or who your kind of community is those are the people who are going to interact with it most frequently. However, if you have mayors or district representatives or state representatives, schools or other businesses that are close by, those are also considered a part of that community and will probably interact with the garden or green space at some point in time. The next part of community garden is the garden part. So that's the physical area where people are interacting with the environment. So that, garden is nice. Oftentimes that garden is just a part of a larger green space. With a lot of the community gardens that I work with in Louisville, the gardens are often a small part of a larger park. So that community part of the community garden really gets muddled in because the green space is often sometimes conflated with the garden and the garden with the green space. And so you have to really take into account that, that nature kind of overlappingness of the physical surrounding. I'm going to use the term green space a lot too as we go forward, because oftentimes, right, especially in my situation where I have gardens, right, places where people grow vegetables and fruits that are intermixed with a public park or other larger kind of grassy or green recreation area, that entire green space then becomes a part of the garden to some degree, depending on the location. You all have access to this handout. I just wanted to point it out really quickly. Community gardens, right, involve a lot of different players. I work a lot in Louisville with a whole consortium of people through the Urban Ag Coalition. And as a collective group here in Louisville, we use this How to Start a Community Garden Guide that was developed by Grow Pittsburgh, whose logo you'll see in one corner, and then Common Earth Gardens, which is a refugee agriculture program in Louisville. So we have spent a lot of time in the city thinking about gardens and green spaces, both as cooperative extension and also what that larger ecosystem looks like. And this is the guideline that we utilize, and I'm going to kind of share with everyone in some more detail. You all should have access to this one-page document as a PDF as well. But this is what I'm going to be talking about for the rest of it. So the most important part of a community garden or green space is the community. You will not have a community garden if you don't have community, right? Without that, it's just a garden. So I really, really, really want everyone to focus on this, especially if this is something you're thinking about for the future. So build that community. Talk to your friends and neighbors. We always, when we're starting a garden in Louisville or even rebuilding connections around a garden or green space, but particularly if you're starting a new green space, plan on knocking on every door in a 3-block area. So that's every residence, every business, every school, every church, every warehouse, garage. Talk to everyone in a 3-block area. And talk to them about a community green space. Talk to them about a garden. A lot of times, especially if you're looking at an area that may already be an existing park or a field, that green space, everyone probably has something in their brain about what happens in that space because they personally use it, what they want to see there, what their hopes are. So by using the term green space, you're opening up opportunities for folks to be creative and to develop an area into a multi-purpose location that can include a garden, but can also include things like walking paths, playgrounds, picnic tables, a small shelter, basketball courts, nature trails, butterfly garden, you know, like lots of different things. So use the term green space as you're talking to those community members. Hopefully, right, you're not doing this alone, again, because you're building your community. So host some events, invite everyone in that 3-block radius and have them interact and share their visions with this green space. So we like to ask people what they want to see in the green space, how they want to feel in the green space, and what things they want in the green space. So we very frequently will utilize some giant sticky notes and sidewalk chalk and a lot of other ways for people to draw and write and think about what they want to see, feel, and do in that area. So we use the eyeballs, the heart, and then a bench or maybe a rock or a playground image for people to get them thinking about all of the different feelings that they want associated with this green space. So after you've talked to everyone in the 3-block radius, had a community event, it's time to hold your first community green space meeting. So this means that you and the other folks who have kind of started having this vision together are going to come back together and share results from that visioning activity. So you're going to share and kind of look over those results as a group. See if there's any commonalities between the things that people want to see, people want to feel, and then the different things that they would like in that green space. So this is your chance to really all kind of refocus and figure out kind of that gradient of involvement, because you may have some folks who want to just go and have a picnic in an area, and then you may have other folks who want to be out there and have a garden. So, right, those levels of interaction look different, but it's important to honor and respect all of those different interactions and think about how to hold value to them in that green space. So from there, you're looking at your results. You want to brainstorm as a group what your next steps are. This is going to look a little different depending on your specific community, the scope of the project, and the number of people involved. So you all may decide that you want to first develop a site plan and a map. You may need to divide into working groups to focus on specific areas of this vision that you have. So from there, as you're thinking about your next steps, time to organize. You want to start organizing people. You're going to have, again, a gradient of involvement, and that's good. You need to have a core group of about 10 people who are going to be active and engaged leaders. And that leadership and what active and engagement looks like is really site specific. But again, the focus is community. So having a community of 10 is a strong body to make decisions, to delegate tasks, to come back together, and to also share the load of communicating out to everyone in that 3-block radius. A big part of that community organizing is thinking about rules. So figure out how decisions are going to be made. Is it by fiat? Is it majority rules? Is it by money available? Is it we are delegating all responsibilities to Sharon and whenever Sharon says goes? There are lots of right ways to make decisions. The important things is that that your community has an agreed upon plan for how to make those decisions. And then through that, you're gonna develop a shared vision for that community space. So through that, like learning how to work together and organize as a group, you wanna think about how those decisions are made and how that translates into the green space that you are developing collectively. So focus on the garden or green space second. Again, without community, it's just a garden. So you really want to focus and nail down that community first and then think about the garden. So a lot of times some of these things happen at the same time, and that's okay. So focusing on that garden or green space second means looking for land. Oftentimes the land has already been identified as a part of this brainstorming or visioning process. So you've probably identified the location as a part of that. Wow, I'd love to have a garden in X location. But it's also important to step back and look around and see, well, I want a garden here, but what if I drove a half a mile in the other direction? Maybe there's already a garden there. So take a look around and see if there are other gardens or parks or publicly used green spaces that are already close by. If those exist, really think as a group and as yourself, like, do we need another one of these things? Should it be different now because we might have two of the same? Or is it important, do we have the need and the capacity within our space to have maybe two of the same thing in a close area? Again, your specific situation is how those questions are going to be answered. I can give you some examples. In Louisville, we have an area where we have several community gardens located within about a 3-mile radius of each other. But because Louisville is very neighborhood specific, each of those community gardens is physically located in a different neighborhood. And so even though they're physically very close to each other, those gardens are meeting needs for other people. So that's an example of where it might make sense to have like duplicates of the same thing in a small space. So once you've identified your land and answered the question, do we need a garden or green space? Then you need to assess the land, particularly in urban areas, but also in rural areas. Finding out land ownership is a really, really critical part of that. So find out who owns the land and start making contact with the owner. Oftentimes, I know in urban areas, we're often surprised to learn that what we assumed was a public park may actually be privately owned, but is leased to the Metro Park system. And so those kinds of conversations are really important because if you don't personally own the land, you need permission from the landowner in order to utilize that. Then you really need to just think about the site history. So find out if it's always been a field, if it maybe was a car parking lot at some point, was there a chemical factory here, buildings, any kind of things like that. So find out what's happened there in the past, because that may also dictate what can happen there in the future. So in terms of suitability for building things, if you're planning on putting a playground or other kinds of buildings, water lines, you need to make sure that you can do those things. And so that's a part of learning about the past, so you can kind of think about how that impacts your present. The next is think about your current land use. So that comes in right again with that question, those community visioning questions about what do you want to see, feel, and what things do you want in that space. Oftentimes some people see something as just a vacant lot or an open field, but maybe the 3 houses that are directly adjacent to it, that's the place where they have neighborhood get-togethers and bonfires. Or there's a group of kids who always go play hide and seek there, or there's an elementary school that uses that area to collect leaves for a class or some other activity. So a part of, that community engagement piece is learning about how people are already currently interacting with that space because oftentimes people want to continue that interaction. They may want to improve it or change it in some way, but you want to value that existing interaction first. And then finally, as a part of your assessment of the land, is check in about the infrastructure. So if a part of your plan involves having city water access or well water access, does it already exist there? Will you need to install those things? Are there buildings on the site? Are you able to build buildings on the site if that's a part of your plans? If you need electricity in your green space, is it already there? Do you need to hook up? All of those things are really, really important as a part of that site assessment. Finally, then you want to think about, if a garden is even in that community plan, you need to think about what type of community garden you want. And I'll go over that a little more in a minute. But oftentimes, again, the community garden part or the garden part of this green space is just a small snippet of that larger community vision for what the green space should be. So the fourth part of the garden is to design the space with your community group. So keep coming back to that group of 10 plus people. Hopefully everyone in a 3-block radius on all sides is going to be really involved in this. Maybe they're not, but make sure you're communicating out with all of those people and giving them the opportunity to provide input on that space. And then again, with the garden, right? You've got to organize. So once you have that vision, you've got to think about kind of those nitty-gritty details of how much money do you need to realize this dream? How are you going to get that money? Do you have a wealthy benefactor that's going to provide that? Are you applying for grants? How is that all coming about? If you are working with a private landowner or a public landowner, you probably want a land use agreement unless you are buying the land outright, either as a church or a nonprofit. You need to think about what maintenance looks like for this green space. So part of that, what you want to see question is part of those personal values for the neighbors and anyone who's interacting with it. Do people want to see land that is always a nicely mowed green lawn that has all fescue? Do they want to see wildflowers and tall grasses or trees? We all have different aesthetic values, so it's really important to communicate and decide as a group what that kind of visual aesthetic for that green space is going to be. And then also, how are you going to keep it in that way, shape, or form? So does that mean you have a series of volunteers who mow the grass or trim trees or bushes? Do you need to hire a landscaping company to do those things? If you're putting in a water line, do you need the water spigots to be at a certain pressure? Do you want the water spigots to visually look a certain way? Do you want water fountains for people to drink out of? Do you want water fountains for dogs? All of those different things are important. So thinking about what you want and then how you're going to, 1, install it, and then 2, maintain it in that capacity. And then the final part of the garden or green space is build and grow. So start working together to build or implement your plan, and then continue checking back in to make sure that that plan is happening and that you are following through. So if a community garden is a part of your green space plan, there are 3 fairly common types of community gardens out there. And it's really important to decide as a group what type of community garden you want to have. And then you also want to think about how you're going to announce this specific type of community garden out to people so they know, so they also have a shared understanding of this word. So in this slide are the 3 kind of most common types of community garden that I run into in Louisville. And there are others. So creating a shared definition of community garden is very, very important. And then communicating what that definition is and that expectation out is also really important to the success of your garden. So the most common type of community garden that I run into, and probably the one that we think about the most, is an allotment garden. So an allotment garden is a common space. So think like a public park that has individual plots in it. So everyone gets X amount of square feet that an individual commits to gardening, and then they also commit to the harvest from that specific square footage. So that means that I have my own garden, Sharon has her own garden, Amy has her own garden, Catherine has her own garden, on and on and on. I will only work in my garden and I will only harvest from my garden. Sharon will only work in her garden and she will only harvest from her garden. So oftentimes, and so that's how an allotment garden works. It's kind of more of the individual homeowner type perspective of a community garden. The next type of garden, community garden, that we hear a lot about, and that is the most common definition for folks who are hoping to benefit from community gardens without working, is the cooperative garden. So a cooperative garden is, in general, a common space. So it would be, right, a garden, again, inside a park or on a private piece of property like a church, that is worked collectively by a defined group of people. And those people plan the work, do the work, and then share the harvest between those people, between that, right, defined group of people. Here in Louisville, I often see cooperative gardens happen a lot at church sites, also within some of our international community in Louisville. So I think probably the most common example I see is a church or some other group will say that we have extra land, we've got 10 or 15 people, we're all going to grow a vegetable garden, we're going to grow tomatoes, green beans, peppers, whatever. They plan their garden together, they all develop a work schedule and a work plan, and then as things are harvested, it may be split among those 10 individuals who are there, or they are all harvesting and then maybe donating it to a food bank, or maybe a relief ministry associated with that specific community. And so that cooperative garden is a very, very common one that's out there as well. Again, and I see that happening a lot with churches and other kind of defined community centers most frequently. The final type of community garden is the U-Pick, or the U of L, University of Louisville lovingly calls it the anarchist community garden, because they have one of these on their campus. And I just love that term, so I've adopted it from them. So the anarchist community garden is, again, a common garden space that really has no plan. So anyone can show up in that garden and plant whatever they want, and anyone can show up and harvest whatever they want. And it doesn't matter if you never work in it, you can harvest from it. And if you never harvest from it, you can still work in the garden. So that is kind of the third type of garden. A lot of folks like to think that all community gardens are a U-Pick situation where anyone who wants to can come through and pick yourself. I would say that's probably the most common challenge that I see among the community gardens that I work with in Louisville. And so it's really, really important as you are establishing your community garden to provide some signage and direction for participants of many different levels about the expectations for that community garden. So making signs, I love signs, put up a lot of signs that say, hey, this is a community garden. In this garden, you only pick what you plant. You can look but not touch. Feel free to take all the pictures you want. That's a sign that we have up in the 7th Street Community Garden here in Louisville. Our Emerson Community Garden in Louisville is more direct. They have signs all over their garden that say, if you didn't plant it, don't pick it. And those are all allotment type gardens that are in public parks. And so they are very aware of the challenges where folks come in and do a U-Pick situation. And so that's how they have that. University of Louisville has an anarchist community garden. They have wonderful raised beds in the center of their campus, and they have the sign, free veggies, help yourself, all over their garden. And then they also have a sign that has a rotating list of chores. So they have the free veggies, help yourself. Then they also have a sign that says, if you're here, feel free to, and they'll list 3 or 4 things. So they'll say water, weed, tie up the tomatoes, harvest bell peppers, something kind of like that. So there is some commitment there in that anarchist type garden to providing guidance, but it's very minimal, and ultimately kind of anything goes in that situation. So again, these are the 3 most common types of community gardens that I run into, but there are many, many others. And depending on your situation, you're going to come up with the type of community garden that works best for your community. I would just encourage you all to communicate out in many different ways what your expectations are for interaction with the different community gardens. Okay, so I'm just going to launch into kind of some tips about, say you've talked to your community, you've got a strong group of 10 people who are actively involved in the leadership and maintenance of your garden, and then you've designed and built your garden. So we're just going to talk about how do you keep it going? Because quite honestly, it is harder to keep the momentum going in these public green spaces than it is to have the momentum when you're doing something new and fresh. So that's what this is all about. So the key here, again, is to focus on the community. Your community green space is only going to thrive through community involvement. So really, establish a leadership committee. If you've got a small garden, you may only need a leadership committee of 3. If you've got a larger garden, you may need as many as 10 people. So that leadership committee is responsible for helping with decision making. They may be doing day-to-day maintenance. They may be coordinating volunteer days. They are kind of the engines that are keeping that green space going. You want to establish shared actions and ideals for your community space. So that comes back to you've decided on what type of community garden. You may have decided hours of access, or those may be decided for you. So you want to think about those shared actions and ideals for how do you want people to interact with each other, and how do you want them to interact with your green space. So the big questions you need to answer are, how do you solve problems that arise in that space? And then how do you solve shared work, or how do you share work for kind of that upkeep and maintenance? So those kind of logistical questions of who mows the lawn, if that's a part of your maintenance plan. Who fixes the playground if something breaks? Who fixes the water lines if it breaks? What do you do about any graffiti or vandalism if it occurs? So those are all kind of those establishing shared actions and ideals. And that dovetails right in with that leadership committee. Nothing happens in a vacuum, so hold regular garden meetings. For the community gardens that I work with, we have monthly meetings, May through October. We meet in the garden, generally rain or shine. We do cancel for thunderstorms or very, very severe weather or very cold weather. But generally we meet once a month, May through October, just to do a check-in with everyone about kind of how are things going. So we ask what's going well, what problems are arising, and then we brainstorm as a group how we're going to solve those problems. And then sometimes we'll dovetail that into also a class about solving a specific issue, or if that's something that can wait, maybe we'll plan a community class for a later time to maybe, if everyone's having a problem with tomato diseases, we'll plan a class for a week or 2 later about a shared problem, if it's maybe an educational issue. We also hold planning meetings in the winter. People tend to not want to meet outdoors in the winter as often, but sometimes we do meet outdoors. But we do check in over the winter to think about goals for the next year, right? If we're seeing kind of ongoing issues throughout the growing season, the winter's a great time to sit down and reflect and to think about, wow, what like management changes do we need to make, or leadership changes, or I didn't realize that everyone was going to grow these really prickly raspberry bushes and they're now crowding out all the shared sidewalks. How do we want to handle that? So those winter planning meetings are a really great time for reflection and strategizing for the next year. And then finally, make sure you're interacting with that larger 3-block radius community. So hold community-wide events. Those may just happen once or twice a year. When the weather is nice, but it's a really important way to invite and share those actions and ideals out with the folks who are maybe not as actively involved in that green space. So a lot of what I have happen at different community gardens that I work with, sometimes they'll organize a garden and neighborhood tour. So we'll start at the community garden and we'll do a tour of the garden where people will highlight what they're doing, and then we'll go and tour some homes around that community garden and do a little walking tour of the neighborhood or some history. Some of our community gardens that I work with, they have music events that they open up to that entire 3-block radius, and they say, hey, you know, Wednesday we're having live music in the garden, bring a lawn chair. So make sure that you invite kind of the more casual participants into that green space, and that's a way for you all to meet each other, to kind of build bridges and understanding on expectations for that event, and to also maybe try to mitigate any conflict that may arise. For example, some people may grumble a lot, but maybe because they're not a gardener, they don't feel involved and have a say, but they really just don't like the way that something looks, or they wish the grass were shorter, or they wish that someone was maintaining a pollinator garden. So it's a good time to have those community events and to learn how to build partnerships and bring new people in, or to just make sure that everyone is happy with how things are going. If it's appropriate, making those community events community work days can also be a really great way to build relationships and engagement. And finally, through those community events and community work days, you're building partnerships. So make sure you're inviting the local businesses, the local councilmen or judge executives, or the principal of the high school, church leaders, churches, elementary schools, middle schools, high schools, any of those places. It's super, super important to build partnerships, because those are the folks who you can count on to help when maybe things don't go quite as well, or maybe you have an emergency and need some assistance with something, either manpower or money. So that's just really important to keep building those partnerships. So keep your garden growing and focus it on the community. So the last question that I want to address is, what about the plants? So a lot of times, right, when we hear the term community garden, we focus on like the garden and the growing and the rules around that. And quite honestly, the plants are the easiest part of the garden. Plants generally, with a little bit of love and care, and some of you all who have grown gardens in the past may know, maybe even with no love and care, those plants are probably going to grow and thrive if you put in even just a little bit of effort. And so this picture to me is really representative of that. This is the community pollinator space in the Emerson Community Garden. It was an individual garden that someone, quote, was planting for the community, but because of that individual's role and some of their behaviors, it kind of morphed over the years into this shared space where one gardener brought in a bird bath. Another gardener said, I have elephant ears from my friend's house and I'd love to plant them here. And so over time, that space has morphed, and the Emerson Garden developed this vision as a group about how they actually wanted to have a community pollinator space and what it would look like, and then what kind of the maintenance would be. So I just really want to emphasize that the plants really take care of themselves, and this is a beautiful pollinator space that is owned by no one and managed by no one, but it's also managed by everyone and owned by everyone. And so I really always think about that in that space. So to kind of end up, and you all have access to this as well, a few resources that I really love, if you are personally interested in starting a community garden, is the Community Gardens in Louisville, a Startup Guide. So this is really thinking about how to set up an allotment type garden, particularly in an urban environment. It walks through a lot of the issues around land ownership and land access and what that looks like. The Grow Pittsburgh Community Garden Startup Guide from Grow Pittsburgh specifically. They have one that is maybe a little more like public ownership based green space guide, which I love, that we saw a part of here today and that I'm talking about. But Grow Pittsburgh has many great resources on community gardens and well. And then finally, the Urban Agriculture Coalition in Louisville has lots of great resources through their Food and Neighborhoods website, including that How to Start a Community Garden Guide that you all have access to as well. It's just a really wonderful way to think about community gardens as community spaces and not so much as gardens.